팔레스타인에서 온 시마라고 합니다. 반갑습니다. Today I'm honored to share with you a portion of my thesis research on how Palestinian women in South Korea experience the effects of colonialism and diaspora, and how this connects to broader youth struggles for peace and solidarity. The goal of my research was to understand how Palestinian women living in South Korea deal with the questions of identity, belonging, and activism after the Gaza genocide that began in October 2023. I wanted to know, how do they introduce themselves, how do they explain where they are from, and how do they handle being seen only through the lens of conflict and war. My study also looks at the role of women in carrying emotional and cultural responsibilities like teaching others about Palestine, correcting misunderstandings, and building bridges with Korean society. I hope to fill a gap in research, since most studies about Palestinians in diaspora focus on the West, like the US or Europe, and a very little is known about experiences in East Asia, especially in South Korea. So originally, Palestinian national identity has been shaped by historical trauma, displacement, and ongoing struggles for self-determination. Surviving through cultural and political and intellectual work, despite the absence of a sovereign state, women have always been central to this process, not only through visible activism, but also through everyday acts of resistance, like raising families, preserving traditions, and sustaining concepts. The concept of sumud, or steadfastness. Since the start of the Gaza genocide in October 2023, Palestinian resistance has taken on new transnational dimensions, with diaspora communities, including women, using activism, digital mobilization, and alliances with other marginalized groups to assert their voices, though often facing repression and misrepresentation. In South Korea, a unique but underexplored context marked by its own history of colonization and division, Palestinians confront both invisibility and stereotypes shaped by pro-Israeli narratives, US influence, and Christian Zionism. For Palestinian women in South Korea, identity becomes a constant negotiation between homeland and hostland, survival and resistance, offering critical insights into how global and local forces shape diasporic life and activism. So through interviews I have done with migrant Palestinian women in South Korea, and through analyzing the South Korean scene in relation to the Israeli occupation of Palestine, I have come to findings which provided a deeper picture of how these women navigate visibility, solidarity, and resistance in their lives here in South Korea. First, Palestinian women in South Korea experience identity as fluid and constantly negotiated, shaped by place, audience, and unfolding events in Palestine. They emphasize their Palestinian identity as a marker of national pride and historical specificity. Yet in Korea, this often becomes reduced to conflict or misunderstood altogether. After October 7, 2023, Palestine gained global attention, but South Korea's cautious political stance and reliance on Western media limited deeper in engagement, leaving women simultaneously supported by solidarity networks, yet frustrated by shallow awareness. Their identities are further complicated by intersecting factors such as legal status, religion, class, and visibility. For instance, stateless Palestinian women face different contradictions than those, for example, with Israeli citizenship, while visibly Muslim women encounter Islamophobia. The Gaza genocide also intensified the politicization of identity, where simply being Palestinian became a statement, placing women in a paradox of hyper-visibility and invisibility, spotlighted as the Palestinian voice in protests and classrooms, yet personally erased and reduced to stereotypes or victimhood, terrorism or foreignness. This constant burden of representation generates psychological stress and forces strategic choices of self-expression, making identity less about geography and more about positionality, with survivor, negotiation, and resilience becoming everyday acts of resistance. Second conclusion I came to is that South Korea holds a unique place for Palestinians because its history of colonization, war, and national division is similar to many aspects of the Palestinian experience. Palestinian women believe Korea's colonization under Japan, the devastation of the Korean War, and the enduring division between North and South Korea mirror the Palestinian experience of the Nakba, displacement and fragmentation of Palestinian lands. For Palestinian women in Korea, these parallels create potential points of empathy and understanding, as events like the Jeju massacre resonates with their own narratives of occupation and loss. At the same time, their daily lives are marked by alienation as they confront cultural misunderstandings, xenophobia, and Orientalist stereotypes. They are often expected to explain or defend their identities, correcting misconceptions about Palestine and Islam while trying to build solidarity in a society that often not always recognize their complexity. The Gaza genocide brought more visibility, uniting Palestinian communities and sparking activism, but structural barriers such as the lack of Palestinian diplomatic ties to Korea, knowing the fact that there is no embassy for Palestinians in Korea, fragmented networks, and limited public awareness still constrained their efforts. For many women, activism became both transformative and burdensome. While most first came to Korea as students, the violence in Gaza compelled them into action, pushing them to organize protests, give speeches, and connect with supportive Koreans. These activities empowered them to reclaim the Palestinian narrative, build community, and resist helplessness. Yet they also brought new pressures. Tensions within solidarity movements, Korea's geopolitical ties to the US and Israel, Islamophobia, and visa restrictions limited their space for safe participation. Beyond politics, activism was felt more as a moral duty or an obligation that intensified emotional exhaustion but also gave meaning to their presence in Korea. Despite these constraints, Palestinian women created spaces of agency by blending feminist resistance with cultural survivor. Their decision to remain visible, educate others, and resist erasure became everyday acts of political defiance, challenging both external colonial forces and internal patriarchal structures within their own communities. Third conclusion was that Palestinian women in South Korea are often positioned as representatives of their homeland, expected to explain Palestine, Islam, and Arab culture in classrooms, protests, and daily life while carrying the emotional weight of grief and trauma from afar. This role as cultural translators creates immense psychological pressure, intensified by South Korea's monocultural nationalism, religious conservatism, and Orientalist stereotypes that force them to first justify the Palestinians' experience before speaking of their struggles. Activism can empower them, yet it also reinforces expectations that women embody the ideal Palestinian, who is resilient, articulate, and ever ready to represent, leaving them with this proportionate emotional labor compared to men, often resulting in burnout or isolation. Despite these challenges, they resist erasure through everyday acts of survival, from preserving traditions and building solidarity to simply refusing invisibility. Through this comes at the personal cost of living in between, physically in Korea, yet emotionally bound to Palestine, carrying survivor's guilt while turning their grief into stories and digestible for others, embodying both strength and vulnerability as forms of resistance. And my last conclusion was that one of the most powerful insights from my conversations with the Palestinian women in South Korea is that they resist not only through visible activism, but also through the simple act of living as Palestinians in a society that often misunderstands or erases them. Their everyday existence becomes a quiet yet powerful form of resistance, whether through speaking Arabic in public, wearing traditional clothing, creating art or academic work about Palestine, correcting misinformation, or supporting one another in times of grief. Even carrying the heavy emotions of displacement, colonial violence, and guilt during the genocide itself is an act of survival. By refusing to disappear, These women assert their right to exist, tell their own stories, and be seen as fully human, complex, emotional, and imperfect, rather than reduced to victims or symbols. This is resistance rooted not in slogans, but in dignity. So the theme of this roundtable and how war shapes the lives of young people and how youth can work together across borders for peace speaks directly to the experiences of Palestinian women in South Korea. Even though that the violence in Gaza and the ongoing occupation of Palestine are physically far away, they are never distant from our daily lives. For young Palestinian women here, including myself, colonial violence follows us in invisible ways, in the questions we are asked about who we are, in the burden of having to explain our homeland, and in the grief of watching destruction unfold while being far from our families. This shows us that war is not about battlefields, it stretches into classrooms, friendships, and everyday encounters, shaping how young people negotiate in their identity and sense of belonging across the world. This also connects to the second purpose of today's event, which is to imagine how young people can build solidarity across borders. Palestinian women in South Korea have found ways, both big and small, to turn their pain into action. Some joined protests, others gave talks or shared their stories, and many worked quietly by teaching friends and classmates about Palestine, or simply keeping the Palestinian culture alive in a new place. These acts might seem modest, but altogether, they create spaces of connection. They also remind us that solidarity does not only come from shared politics, but also from shared histories. Korea's own history resonates deeply with Palestinians, and these parallels open possibilities for empathy and alliance. In this sense, Palestinian women's experience here reveal how youth solidarity can grow from understanding both differences and similarity, from recognizing the unique struggles we carry, but also the common desire for peace and dignity. Finally, by adding the perspective of Palestinian women, we also bring attention to the gendered side of youth struggles. Women are often expected to represent their communities, to remain strong and articulate even when grieving, and to carry emotional and cultural responsibilities that go unseen. This tells us something about peace building, that it's not only about formal negotiations or political agreements, but also about everyday survival, care and persistence of those who hold their communities together. In this way, the experiences of Palestinian women in Korea connect closely to the goals of this discussion, to understand how wars shape youth and to explore how young people can respond with resilience, solidarity, and the determination to imagine a more just future. Thank you so much. 감사합니다.